There's nothing that visitors to Ontario find stranger than to get off the plane, go to a hotel or go to visit friends and realize that they have to go to a government liquor store or a government-controlled beer store to buy alcohol. That's simply not something that they're used to, and they think this is quite strange. And we sort of sheepishly say, well, that's just Ontario. That's the way we run things.
Behind you is a magical wall that you can't see. But on that side of the wall, I can sell beer till 11. On this side of the wall, I can sell beer till 2 a.m. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's absolute nonsense.
It's quite striking, especially if you're not from Canada originally, and I'm from Spain. So, you know, coming into this country, my family immediately noticed that there were any number of really peculiar rules and regulations that applied to all aspects of drinking and the sale of alcohol, the purchase of alcohol, where you could drink, and so on.
I remember once hearing a story of a friend who was visiting someone from Europe, and the guy said it was like a bread line in the Soviet Union. Like, he couldn't believe that he was in Toronto, and that was the way that product was being distributed.
Chinese state television came and interviewed me last year about how crazy our laws were.
Ontarians don't need to travel very far to see how our rules about buying alcohol differ from our neighbors to the east in Quebec or to the south in the United States. A short drive across the border is Sylvan Liquors, a private, independent liquor store in Sylvan Lake, Michigan.
I have over 1,500 different beers in here. All different, from breweries from all over the world. We got all from Belgium to Norway, down from Germany to Italy, all the way down to maybe somewhere in Indiana and California, you know, all to the States. You have to do a lot of research yourself. You got to stay up to date on what's coming out, what's coming in, because a lot of the guys are big followers, you know. Oh, hey, this whiskey's coming out by this, or hey, this gint's coming out. And you know what sells in your area, you got to know your type of clientele that you have. A lot of the guys, our main customers are, you know, beer connoisseurs. They like drinking beers, they like drinking the different styles.
In Ontario, we have very little choice about where we can buy alcohol. The majority of booze is sold through the Liquor Control Board of Ontario and the beer store. According to the LCBO, their stores and the beer store sell almost 90% of all alcohol by volume in Ontario. If you've ever been to a store like Sylvan Lake Liquors, you know that there are thousands of great products from around the world that never get on the shelves in Ontario. You've probably noticed some substantial price differences too. What's even more bizarre is that there are hundreds of great products made in Ontario that are effectively excluded from the province's retail system. It would be hard to imagine this scenario in France, or Italy, or California. So why do we have government-run liquor stores? Why is there a thing called the beer store? What is the beer store? Where did all of these rules come from? As Ontario enjoys an emerging renaissance of beer, wine, and spirit production, it's time to take a comprehensive look at the sale of alcohol in Ontario. The story of the Ontario beverage alcohol system is over 100 years in the making. It's a story of good and evil, of power and greed. So let's start at the beginning. The temperance movement in Ontario originated in much the same way it did elsewhere in North America and Europe. People all over the world had been consuming beer and wine for centuries, but starting in the 1800s, temperance advocates and public policy makers began to see drinking as a problem.
I think you have to look at temperance, the emergence of the temperance movement, as part of a process that was underway well back in the 19th century to try and change human personality away from its self-indulgence, against too much pleasure, and towards a great deal of self-control, self-discipline, constraint, sobriety in every aspect of life.
You know, when we look historically, we say, how could they have been so stupid to have prohibition? But we have to understand that for probably nearly 100 years before that, there was an increasing concern with the amount of alcohol people were drinking.
The prohibition movement by the late 19th century was making a very loud case that poverty was caused, straightforwardly, simply caused by excessive alcohol consumption.
If we think about today, the way a lot of people frame drug laws, that is similar to the way drink was considered. It was considered this thing that was rotting out the inside of our society.
So in 1916, the proponents of temperance finally got their way. Despite the fact that he headed up an otherwise free market-oriented conservative party with a number of members who believed that alcohol consumption was a personal choice, Premier William Howard Hearst, himself a Methodist and temperance advocate, passed the Ontario Temperance Act. It became illegal to possess beverage alcohol outside one's home or to sell alcohol to another person. Taverns and liquor stores were shut down. And despite the fact that drinking was widespread in Ontario at that point, drinkers didn't really put up much of a fight.
The interesting thing about the drinkers is that when public inquiries were held, there was a big royal commission in the 1890s. No drinkers came forward to say, we want our right to drink. Mostly it was the producers of alcohol and the temperance people who came in and said their piece. But the actual guys who showed up every week and thought it was perfectly legitimate just quietly thought that they should keep their mouths shut.
The repeal of the Temperance Act was a central issue of the provincial election in 1926, and the Liberal Party, sticking to their support for prohibition, were wiped out by the Ferguson Conservatives by a crushing margin. Perhaps drinkers had finally found their voice, but what would replace the Temperance Act would not be the loosely regulated system that preceded it. The temperance movement was still very strong in Ontario and in North America. The United States wouldn't repeal prohibition for another 7 years. So Ferguson was left with the intricate task of balancing a temperance movement, which was still vocal and engaged, with a sizable population of drinkers who had expressed their will at the ballot box. The sale of alcohol had the potential to be an excellent revenue stream for the government of Ontario, but they didn't want to seem to be profiting from the social harm that the temperance movement attributed to alcohol use. This tension, and the Liquor Control Act that embodied it, would shape Ontario alcohol policy for generations.
The LCBO has been historically embarrassed by profits. One of the earliest compromises that the board made with the temperance movement was to suggest that they would not seek to profit from the sale of alcohol. Now that's a remarkable statement for a money-spinning institution, as we know the LCBO to be today.
Liquor was re-legalized, so to speak, but with extremely strict controls on everything, every possible aspect of it.
The most important matter, I think, is the word control. And by control, they meant not only the control of alcohol, but the control of drinkers of alcohol, consumers.
You could only buy hard liquor in bottles, and you had to go to this special store, and initially you had to have identification to prove that you could buy a bottle of liquor.
Remember, at this time, we have a system in which you enter a shop, enter an LCBO outlet, and there are no bottles of alcohol. The shop is empty, except for a desk. And you approach the desk with your passbook, take out your passbook, make a request for alcohol based upon what that particular employee decides about you, based upon your appearance, the way in which you walk, the way in which you talk, your past history of purchases.
The first staff put behind a counter in the LCBO's shops were intended to control consumption, to make sure that Fred didn't come in too many times every week and deny him liquor. They're basically social workers of trying to keep alcohol from being too heavily consumed.
The contents of each customer's passbook was duplicated by the LCBO and collated at head office. In this way, the LCBO could track alcohol consumption across the province by city or by store. If consumption seemed too high somewhere, they would investigate.
There are sort of scrawled and stamped sections that you see describing more or less the products purchased by individuals over a period of time. And those were sent, in multiple copies to head office and entered into a central, ledger.
But despite the paperwork and the Stalinist customer service model, Ontarians were obviously a thirsty bunch. In the first 5 months, LCBO sales were $17.5 million for a population of about 3 million people. The Ontario government had granted themselves a license to print money and to build one of the first government bureaucracies in Ontario.
Suddenly, you have an opportunity for a bureaucracy. And it was before any sense of bureaucracies are having to be accountable to the public and having to be transparent. I mean, the word transparency just didn't, it didn't really exist.
So for most of the 20th century, the LCBO was making rules at board meetings, closed to the public, no minutes published, and this became the law of the land.
This kind of completely illiberal sort of system of surveillance and inspection happened.
There's a lot of sort of discussion on how detailed the surveillance of people was.
And the entire edifice of the gathering and analysis of personal information was based upon control.
I think there's a really interesting strategy they used within the language of this, which is create this idea of this omniscient board that would know when you were bad, right? So they would say things like, it has come to our attention a lot, right? It has come to the board's attention. When often it was just one guy at the board got a letter or a phone call. They just wanted to make sure that you never knew when you were being watched.
We also have, at this point in the history of the institution, the interinstitutional trade-offs and exchange of data going on about personal data.
So what happened if you bought too much demon rum or otherwise abused your privileges to purchase alcohol? Well, you could get put on the interdiction list, also referred to as the drunk list, or worse, the Indian list. When anyone came in to make a purchase at the LCBO, the permit endorser would check to see whether your name was on the interdiction list. If it was, you couldn't buy alcohol. There weren't any published rules as to what specific activities would get your name on the drunk list. It was common for policemen, public officials, or even spouses to report on those who were seen to be drinking excessively and get them added to the drunk list. Private homes were searched. Friends and family were interviewed to determine whether someone was drinking too much. The records show that it was much easier to get on the drunk list if you were a woman, a minority, poor, or a native Canadian.
LCBO recapitulates all of the social prejudices of the time. However, it also exaggerates some of them because it had its own kind of powers, or it believed it had its own powers to investigate in depth individual behavior. First Nations are infantilized, Northerners are suspect because they are heavy drinkers, so to speak, and certain other groups are watched. You know, there was a very strict gender divide in terms of the way in which alcohol could be accessed for decades and upon decades in the history of this province.
But in the 80-plus years since the creation of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the organization has changed, and slowly the controls were loosened as temperance sentiments gave way to more relaxed public attitudes to liquor consumption. Liquor permits were phased out in 1961, and the drunk list along with it. More stores were built, and store hours were extended. Today, the LCBO is a modern, award-winning retailer that operates bright, big-box retailing outlets carrying beer, wine, and spirits from all over the world.
Now they're even more peculiar because now they've evolved into these hybrid bodies that on the one hand are tightly regulating where and when and who is able to drink. On the other hand, they're also promoting liquors, and they're saying, oh, come to the LCBO and you can sample whiskeys or something like that, like the kind of thing that in 1928 would have seemed completely contrary to the purpose.
It seems like a good step forward to try to modernize the stores, and in a way, if some level of modernization had not happened, it's very likely that we would have, much more push to have a private system in Ontario.
One of the characteristics of bureaucracy is that it needs to recreate and protect itself.
At the turn of the century, the Ontario brewing industry was a busy, vital sector, with 61 breweries operating in the province in 1902. These were tiny operations by today's standards, serving local or regional markets. However righteous the intentions of the temperance movement, prohibition had a devastating effect on the brewing industry in Ontario. Some breweries survived by selling beer to other jurisdictions, or by producing non-alcoholic temperance-approved beverages such as ginger beer and soda. After the Ontario Temperance Act was repealed in 1927, the post-prohibition era of Ontario brewing began with 30 breweries. Since beer was mostly sold in kegs, the Liquor Control Board decided it wasn't suited to dealing with the unique challenges related to handling beer, so the board decided to let the industry handle it themselves.
The provincial government really didn't want to get into the distribution of domestic beer. It was all locally produced in Ontario. Some were big and some were small, but there was a whole collection of them.
Then, as now, beer was seen as inherently less dangerous as a beverage because of its low alcohol content, so the board believed that private businesses could sell it responsibly.
From the very beginning of government control after Prohibition, it was assumed that beer was a better alcoholic product to drink than spirits, so you put them in a separate line of regulation from the LCBO. But you gave them a heck of a lot of independence to decide what to market and how to market it. And that has continued right down to the present.
Brewers Warehousing was granted a provincial charter on October 26, 1927, and the company's monopoly on wholesale distribution began. In the beginning, Brewers Warehousing didn't operate stores like the beer store does today. The organization simply took care of warehousing and distribution to private retailers. The system operated on a cost recovery basis, financed by service charges paid by the breweries, proportional to their sales. To become part of the new co-op, brewers would buy shares and become part owners of the business.
The idea was the government granted them a license so that all the brewers, big and small, would have equal access to a single warehousing system. And it would be run like a cooperative, which I think was a great model because, it was, something that the consumer would have easy access to. And there basically was not a middleman. You don't see any of this in any other country in the world, where all the competitors come together and they have this neutral area where they can distribute their beer.
A rush to invest in the new brewing industry followed, and in 1928, the number of breweries rose to 37. In July of that year, Sir Henry Drayton, chairman of the Liquor Control Board, abruptly announced that he was entirely of the view that it was unnecessary to have any more breweries in Ontario. It's unclear what criteria Drayton and the board used to determine how many breweries were necessary in Ontario. It's one of the first examples of the board's tendency to intervene in the liquor market in a way that effectively favored some businesses over others, with arbitrary limits and fuzzy policy goals. By prohibiting further entrance to the market and allowing the brewers to manage the warehousing and distribution as they saw fit, the LCBO had created the conditions for a period of consolidation and homogenization as established brewers fought for control of a closed but growing market. And one man, a horse racing and industrial magnate, Edward Plunkett Taylor, thrived in this environment. Prohibition and the economic depression delivered the opportunity to buy up small breweries at bargain prices and to create large breweries that would leverage modern production and advertising techniques. This process began in 1930, when 33 breweries were operating. Taylor's new company began swallowing up the competition. His initial spree had given him control of 9 breweries in a year. Sir Henry Drayton, chairman of the Liquor Control Board, approved the mergers, seeing it as a reduction in overhead. In 1940, Canadian Breweries, Labatt, and the handful of other brewers that comprised the Brewers Warehousing strengthened their grip by taking over the retail side of the market. They named the chain of outlets Brewers Retail, and the organization became a fully unified agency from production to sales. The rules dictated that the stores be neutral, with no ads favoring any one brewer, and the beer itself was hidden away out of the sight of the customer, just like LCBO stores.
I'm old enough to remember my grandfather checking off a secret note and handing it to a secret man and getting a case of beer like we had just robbed a bank.
From 1930 to 1953, Taylor acquired a total of 23 breweries and shut down 12 of them. He now controlled the world's largest brewing company. MOLSON moved into the Ontario market in 1955, opening a 300,000 barrel per year brewery on Toronto's waterfront. By the mid-1960s, over 90% of the beer consumed in Canada was being produced by Canadian breweries, MOLSON, and Labatt, known colloquially as the Big Three. In 1968, cigarette maker Rothmans of Pall Mall bought control of Taylor's Canadian breweries. By the 1980s, the marketplace shrunk further as Rothmans merged all of its divisions into Carling O'Keefe Breweries, named after its 2 most popular brands. The 60s and 70s were good for the big Canadian breweries. They had a captive market of well-trained consumers who didn't know anything else.
And then a couple intrepid guys with a lot of money and probably a little foolishness start the first 4 or 5 breweries in Ontario. Craft beer, in the last 25 years.
For the beer drinkers of Ontario, The offerings were limited to a small number of similar commodity products. Beer was beer. Every man had his brand and drank nothing else. It took an ad man from Waterloo, Ontario, with exposure to European brewing culture, to lead Ontario beer drinkers out of the MOLSON Labatt Desert. It seems like a fairly obvious idea today, but in the early 80s, it was an audacious venture.
They thought I was nuts. You got to remember at that time, early 70s, 80s, the beer scene was pretty barren. What I wanted to do was bring in a European-style beer that would be fresh, and I'd be making it locally with all the best ingredients that I could get. They said, "You want a manufacturing license?" I said, "Yeah." So they said, they sort of tilt their head and kind of figure out, well, we haven't been asked that for a while.
The modern craft brewing era in Ontario started on December 18, 1984, in an old furniture factory in Waterloo. In the beginning, the Bricks products were mostly lagers. Not a radical departure in terms of style, but probably a good business decision.
Yeah, so the next step for me was to approach the beer store. Government regulations said that, you have to list any brewer that approaches you, right? Just there wasn't any brewers approaching them, so it wasn't like they would say no. And they didn't.
Meanwhile, the continuing state of flux in Ontario's beer brewing business was attracting interest on a global level, and ownership and control of the beer store was about to move into new and even bigger hands. Carling O'Keeffe was bought by Elders IXL of Australia in 1987, and later merged with MOLSON to form MOLSON Breweries Canada in 1989, the year that E.P. Taylor died at 88 with a personal worth of $29 million. In 1988, the Sleeman Brewing and Malting Company was re-established by John W. Sleeman, great-great-grandson of the original founder, John H. Sleeman. The company successfully purchased a 2% stake in Brewers Retail Incorporated, the owner of the beer store, from Northern Breweries. Lakeport took over from Amstel in 1992. In 1995, after almost 150 years of brewing, Ontario's oldest established brewery, Labatt, was acquired by the large Belgian multinational brewer Interbrew, which in 2004 merged with Ambev from Brazil to form InBev, the world market leader headquartered in Leuven, Belgium. In 2005, MOLSON merged with US-based Coors to form the MOLSON Coors Brewing Company. In 2006, Japan's Sapporo Breweries reached a deal to purchase Sleeman, the same year Northern Breweries declared bankruptcy and ceased production. In 2007, Labatt, under InBev, bought the Lakeport Brewing Company.
I'm always surprised at the number of people who don't realize the beer store isn't run by the province.
There are two things if you ask people today. Who owns Creemore? They would say Creemore. And who owns the beer store? They'd say the government. So, and it's in the press all the time, and then all of a sudden they forget about it.
I love you for sentimental reasons. I hope you do believe me. I'll give you my heart.
What we've discovered right from the beginning as we encounter all these laws and rules and regulations, there's very little corporate memory. So nobody really knows the reasons behind a lot of these laws and regulations. Every step of the way we ask the questions, and the answers that come back from the bureaucrats are, we don't know. It's just the way it's been.
In 2005, Dalton McGuinty's Liberal government created the Beverage Alcohol System Review Panel and charged them with a top-to-bottom examination of the system in Ontario. Many in the industry, especially the independent wineries and breweries that had emerged over the last couple of decades, were hopeful that the panel's work would finally deliver some positive reforms to the 78-year-old system. Those impartial experts came back 6 months later with a report entitled A Strategy for Transforming Ontario's Beverage Alcohol System, and made observations that seemed to echo what many observers had been saying for years. The panel wrote that the beverage alcohol system consists of a dynamic retail sector operating within a rigid legal framework largely inherited from the end of the Prohibition era. A government monopoly and a handful of private interests dominate the market. The system is inflexible, and there are many anomalies and inequities. If we could go back to the drawing board, no one would design an ideal system this way. But the report's recommendations went too far for the McGuinty Liberals. Among other things, the report suggested withdrawing government from retail and wholesale operations and supporting the creation of a competitive marketplace. So the panel's report was shelved and the patchwork remains. And while the LCBO and the beer store have certainly added more stores to keep up with population growth and accelerating consumer demand, what hasn't changed in the last few decades is the retail system and who's minding the store. There are more than 1,800 retail outlets where alcohol is sold in Ontario. The LCBO has the largest number of stores, with more than 630. Then there are 440 beer store locations, and almost 300 private wine stores. Add to that more than 200 agency stores. These are the convenience stores or grocery stores that can sell LCBO and beer store products in towns that are too small to support an actual LCBO or beer store. Ontario wine producers are allowed to retail at their winery locations, and there are about 180 of those. Breweries can also sell at their facilities. Then there are also a few on-site distillery stores and duty-free stores. In terms of the number of retail outlets, the level of advantage given to 3 brewers and 6 wineries is striking. Because of licenses issued decades ago to these companies and industry consolidation, we see a few companies enjoying significant structural advantages over almost 300 new breweries and wineries that have emerged in the last 30 years. Another dimension is the split between government-run stores, in other words, the LCBO, and privately run retail stores, which is every other retailer. Social responsibility advocates like the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and the World Health Organization maintain that government-run liquor stores are better at checking IDs and refusing people who are intoxicated, thereby reducing alcohol-related harm. But as it turns out, the majority of retail outlets in the province are privately run. Today, the justification for the LCBO liquor monopoly sits on 2 pillars, much as it did in 1927, but its founders would barely recognize the place today. One pillar is the control of the sale of alcohol. The other is the revenue from LCBO profits that are spent on government programs. So how does the LCBO make money? The LCBO applies a standard markup to each product category, whether it's beer, wine, or spirits. It's these markups, plus a number of different fees and levies, that make up the final price and the board's profits. There are minimum prices for all types of liquor set forth in the Liquor Control Act regulations, but otherwise, the supplier and the LCBO negotiate a wholesale price based on the LCBO's target retail price for that product. On its website, the LCBO publishes a series of pricing examples that list these markups and fees. For a $10 bottle of 100% Canadian Ontario table wine, as the LCBO refers to it, the price breaks down this way. First, the winery gets $4.32, less than half the retail price. Then the $2.83 LCBO markup is added. Then the LCBO wine levy, the LCBO bottle levy, the LCBO environmental fee, the HST, and the container deposit for a grand total of $10. Incidentally, the HST is charged on the LCBO fees, not just the winery's price.
When somebody walks into the LCBO to buy a bottle of wine, the reality is that the majority of the cost of that wine is going into the government's pockets.
The pricing example for beer is provided for a 24-pack of 341 milliliter bottles, which is a bit strange because the LCBO doesn't sell 24 packs, but whatever. For a case of Ontario beer costing the customer $34.95, the price breaks down this way. First, the brewery gets $13.68. Again, less than half the retail price. The federal government gets $2.56 in federal excise tax. Then there's the LCBO in-store cost of service, the LCBO markup, and the LCBO bottle levy. Add 13% HST and the container deposit, and you get to $34.95.
The LCBO does have a margin that they add to the cost of your beer, and so does the beer store. And a lot of brewers use that to say, well, our margins are much better at our own retail store, but that tends to be forgetting that you now have to pay staff to work in your retail store and keep the lights on and all the rest of it.
The most striking markups are applied to whiskey and spirits. For the example of a 750 milliliter bottle of domestic whiskey, retail costs $26.95, the fees and taxes break down this way. The LCBO markup is $13.53, so fully half the retail price. Then the bottle levy, the environmental fee, HST, and container deposit are added. For the domestic manufacturer of the whiskey, this leaves $6.13, about 20% of the price. With this level of markup, it's not surprising that the spirits category accounted for 42% of LCBO net sales in 2012. It's also not surprising that there's only a handful of craft distilleries in the province.
At the provincial level, we have fixed markup structures. So when we give our landed costs to the LCBO, they're sort of indifferent almost to what that will be, but they apply a 140% fixed markup. And any dollar of margin we want to take, that adds $2.50 to the retail price. So that does make it extremely difficult to be a small volume producer. You cannot be profitable in Ontario until you have a tremendous volume because of this markup structure.
And I guess the issue we have as domestic suppliers to the LCBO is that we're paying an import markup, but we're not imported.
The LCBO delivers a lot of money to government programs, but being one of the largest purchasers of beverage alcohol products in the world carries some overhead. The most obvious cost is the wholesale price the LCBO pays to its suppliers for products, and it seems that the LCBO is somewhat indifferent to the wholesale price it pays. A 2011 Auditor General report found that if a supplier's cost quote results in an amount that does not match the agreed upon retail price, the LCBO will ask it to raise or lower the wholesale cost of that product. In case you missed that, the LCBO has actually asked suppliers to raise the wholesale cost of products.
The perception of the LCBO is that they're doing a good job, and maybe according to some dimensions, they can be construed as doing a good job, but they're doing a good job at a high cost.
The LCBO, they respond to consumer pressure. They're in effect owned by us. We're doing a bad job of owning it.
As far as expenses, the LCBO has the same kind of overhead as any other big box retailer that isn't a government monopoly. They have capital expenditures to build the big, spacious, award-winning stores. For instance, according to the LCBO website, their flagship store in Oakville was recognized for its thoughtful design with cutting-edge features by the Retail Council of Canada in the Retail Store Design Large Retailer category.
They build beautiful stores, but that's capital dollars.
Another significant expense is what the LCBO terms cost of sales, including marketing. And again, this is another area in which the LCBO excels. Their sales and marketing division received 2 bronze medals for its 2011 Whisky Rocks campaign. Jody Dunn, managing editor of the LCBO's imaginatively titled food porn magazine, Food and Drink, won a gold award in the media and publishing category in 2012 from the Ontario Hostelry Institute in recognition of the magazine's contribution to the hospitality industry.
I don't understand why the LCBO advertises and takes out commercials telling me what they're doing, because I have no choice if I want to get a bottle of rum in town. I don't care about your magazine, or I hear a radio commercial for the LCBO every day. Why? What's my choice? Leon's? Like, where am I going to get this rum? Who are you? They have a loyalty program. You can get air miles. Why? What loyalty do they need from me? I'm a hostage. But they have a loyalty program to shut me up.
The other big expenditure for the LCBO is wages. The LCBO employs more than 7,500 full-time and casual employees. The Ontario Public Sector Salary Disclosure for 2013 lists 255 LCBO employees making $100,000 per year or more, adding up to more than $32 million in salary and benefits, including the $440,000 package of LCBO President and CEO Robert Peter. Rank-and-file LCBO workers are represented by the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, or OPSU, which also represents a large number of employees in other areas of the Ontario government. OPSU is a vocal proponent of LCBO store expansion, the repatriation of LCBO agency stores to become full LCBO stores, and extending full-time hours and benefits to casual workers.
So when you think about the employees, for example, who are working in the industry, they're all unionized. If there's more competition, there's going to be more employment opportunities, but possibly there'll be lower wages if there's no new unions. So obviously the unions don't want any change.
Regardless of whether you go in for the old left-right, liberal-conservative, ideological thing, it seems a fair question to ask, why is all this needed for a government monopoly? This is especially relevant when, according to Statistics Canada, the per capita net income generated by the LCBO is among the lowest for any provincial or territorial liquor authority in Canada. From the perspective of Ontario's independent beer, wine, and spirits producers, who are typically small to medium-sized businesses, working with the LCBO can be a challenge. As one of the single largest purchasers of beverage alcohol in the world, the LCBO certainly operates like a large organization, with complex and time-consuming purchasing processes. And with thousands of producers around the world clamoring to get on the shelves of the LCBO, Ontario producers are treated the same as manufacturers from anywhere else in the world. And very often these local producers get left out.
There's an upside to dealing with the LCBO and a downside. The upside is it's one-stop shopping for 600 stores across the province. The downside for a smaller winery is they're a very big organization. And whether you sell them 5 cases or 50,000 cases, the process is the same. So for a lot of wineries, it's not worth it. The margins are also significantly different between selling it at your wine shop and at the LCBO. So those are the kind of decisions that wineries look at when they want to offer their products. If you want to grow your business and if you want to grow volumes, you will have to find a way to do business with the LCBO. It's just a matter of whether you can find a fit within their system that works for you.
There are many things the LCBO does very well. It's a big box retailer, really, and so you have to organize your business to work in that system. And we were successful doing that, but latterly it's become more and more challenging, and that's become a problem not only for us but for really all estate wineries.
There's a lot that I think the LCBO deserves credit for. Because they're government mandated, they actually, I think, give Ontario craft brewers more attention than a private chain necessarily would. Where you see the difficulty, though, is particularly for very small, very startup brewers, it's very difficult for them to get a listing and then be able to get that to very many stores. So the process that's involved in getting a listing at the LCBO doesn't change whether you're looking to sell into 3 stores or 300.
Really, they were looking at us the same way they would look at anybody approaching them wanting to get product in. So there was no there was no preferential treatment given to us because we're local, because we're small.
You give up a lot to be in the LCBO. You give up control of your product, the margins aren't great. And then there's always the threat of them telling you you've got to take it back. It doesn't make a lot of sense. If
a bar right now wants to buy our product that's not listed at the LCBO, we put through all this paperwork through the LCBO private order. They send up a 53-foot truck to pick up the 1 bottle. Typically, we have to actually package it on a pallet. They pick up the bottle, they drive it downtown. We're not allowed to deliver, by the way.
Step 1, the licensee sends a licensee order form to the LCBO private order department. Step 2, LCBO private order department contacts us for a supplier quote. Step 3, they forward the supplier quote to the licensee. Do you confirm? Yes, they confirm. Step 4. Step 5, charge the licensee. Step 6, send us a purchase order for what was on the licensee order form. Step 7, we confirm it, send them an invoice. Step 8, schedule a pickup time for them to send around a truck to pick up the 1 case or 2 cases and take it back to their warehouse downtown.
It's like launching a nuclear missile.
I forgot what step I'm on now. Next step, send a notice of pickup available, because, well, they won't let us take it away from the distillery. They will let us then drive back down to their warehouse, pick it back up from them, and then take it to the bar. That's how you do a private order in Ontario.
So that whole process could take 6 weeks.
Even if bars and restaurants are patient enough to navigate the process in order to buy beverage alcohol products from Ontario producers, licensees pay full retail prices. Ever wonder why that bottle of wine is so much more expensive in a restaurant?
Beverage alcohol is the only business input that doesn't enjoy a wholesale price. You know, any of their food products, any of their supplies, they're all subject to a wholesale price. And that allows for markup, that allows for paying staff, that allows for paying rent. But in the beverage alcohol side, that's not the case.
For the Ontario wine industry in particular, industry growth has made it even more difficult to get their products into LCBO stores. A handful of wineries run the private stores, sell popular formats like box wine, and have a long history of listing with the LCBO, advantages that new wineries are denied.
What's changed in Ontario is we now have over 300 VQA wineries and craft breweries in the province now, each making 10, 20, 30 different products. And the shelves at the LCBO just aren't big enough to accommodate all of those products.
Right now, wineries in Ontario, for the most part, can sell in a couple places, primarily at their cellar door. So at the winery is the #1 place. If they are of a certain size and ability, they can start selling to the LCBO. But if the LCBO doesn't want their wine, or for some reason it's just not a good fit, there's nowhere else. And that's sort of unlike any other wine growing region around the world.
The LCBO is forced to ration shelf space in their system because there are so many products from around the world, including Ontario, that are trying to get on those shelves, and they simply don't have the capacity to list everybody's wine.
We currently have 6 of our wines available at the LCBO. I have actually all 20 of our wines are available in Alberta because we can. We've got 9 wines available full-time actually in Hong Kong because it's a private system there and it's much easier to gain entry there.
We have an enormous opportunity here that is right now shackled by the distribution system we have. If we got better access to our own market, there would be enormous benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of agriculture, vineyards planted here in Niagara, all the economic activity that goes along with a prosperous industry.
And then there's Ontario's 87-year-old, grumpy, smelly granddaddy of government-sanctioned anti-competitive business practice, the Brewers Retail Incorporated, or the beer store. 3 private companies, all foreign-owned, have the sole private license to run a chain of retail stores and a beer distribution system in the province. These same privileges are not extended to more than 100 Ontario breweries.
I actually think the brewers have it the worst in terms of absurd barriers in this province, and that's the beer store #1. I mean, I think the LCBO is a great partner for breweries, but they've limited shelf space, and the idea of the notion that we would have to pay a listing fee for each new item is just so offensive.
That's at the beer store?
Yeah, at the beer store. If the province announced that there was going to be something called the Spirit Store, owned by international spirits companies, I would just fold up shop and go home.
It's a market structure unheard of in the rest of the world. There are other jurisdictions with government liquor monopolies like the LCBO, but outside of a petrostate dictatorship, nowhere else do foreign companies get this kind of exclusivity from a government. But the media conversation about the Brewers Retail Inc. usually gets sidetracked in discussions of prices or convenience stores or public safety and social responsibility. It's never about whether the rules are fair to every player in the market.
We're kind of hung up on 2 big problems in Ontario, Labatt's and MOLSON's. We have a system that wouldn't stand any scrutiny of logical thought, but we can't really have any kind of conversation about it because one side just throws up a bunch of nonsense if you try and have a conversation. And the game is rigged. They own every element of it. They own the regulatory environment. They're big political contributors. They own the distribution in this town, like literally. So, they are the only real anomaly in Ontario that explains why we aren't as advanced as New York or any other state.
To me, I just find it fundamentally unfair that 3 brewers are allowed to have a for-profit distribution retail chain in the province, and my brewery's not allowed. And I couldn't team up with 2 other breweries and create another set of stores. I think the biggest downfall to the system is that it's just not fair. If I was allowed to open beer stores as well, then there would at least be fairness in it.
How does the Brewers Retail make money? The pricing breakdown of a 24-pack of Ontario beer at the beer store breaks down in a similar way to the LCBO. But that isn't the whole story if you're an Ontario brewer who wants to be in the beer store. Brewers Retail makes it very clear that they will carry the products of any Ontario craft beer producer, and that it's the brewer who sets the price. The difference, however, is that the Brewers Retail Inc. charges brewers a listing fee to carry their beers in the beer store. The base fee is almost $3,000. Then the brewers charge $224 per store per package. So if the brewer wants a 6, a 12, and a 24 pack in 100 stores, that's about $70,000.
But, if a multinational brewer comes in and, it's peanuts. And that's why they love this system, because it's such easy access to the market for peanuts in their view. But for a small to medium-sized brewery, it's huge.
The fee schedule is part of the standard user agreement that every brewer must sign before the beer store will carry their products. Consider that the Brewers Retail is owned by 3 brewers whose products make up the bulk of the beer store inventory. Even if the beer store owners are paying the listing fee, they're paying it to themselves as the only 3 shareholders in the Brewers Retail Incorporated, who explicitly reserve the right to include a reasonable profit margin on service fees charged to brewers. And consider the competitive implications of a craft brewer selling to the beer store. As a small brewer, you're giving your largest competitors access to the numbers on how many beers you sell by type, package size, by store, and by geographic location.
As part of joining the beer store, I have to sign a document that grants the beer store full competitive data that they can then use to my disadvantage, should they choose to. And there's just a big conflict of interest.
Restaurants and bars are also given special treatment by the Brewers Retail.
I hate to throw around the word outrageous, but I can't think of any other word. If I walked into the beer store and bought, say, for example, a case of Labatt Blue, I'd pay around $30. If a restaurant or pub did the same, they would pay around $45. So that's a significant cost that hits the consumer in that it's higher prices in the restaurant when it finally gets to them.
So why don't bars and restaurants go to the LCBO, which at least doesn't charge extra markups on licensees? Well, they aren't allowed. Under a beer market agreement that is not made available to the public, licensees must purchase any products sold by the beer store at the beer store. So why does the beer store charge this markup when the LCBO doesn't? Why is it allowed? Can they set the markup at any level they want? Why are licensees forced to buy from the beer store? Is there any government oversight of this system? Only the LCBO and the beer store know these answers. The LCBO's Media Relations Department confirmed for us that there exists a beer market agreement between the Brewers Retail Inc. and the LCBO. We submitted an information request to the LCBO, but we've so far been unable to obtain the contents of that agreement. The beer store and Canada's National Brewers, their provincial lobbying firm, have been fighting a vicious social media and public relations battle with the Ontario Convenience Stores Association over the convenience store industry's efforts to seek regulatory changes that would allow the sale of beer and wine in their stores. Despite selling to convenience stores all over the world and right next door in Quebec, the big 3 brewers have been running ads and creating websites that basically say convenience stores can't be trusted to sell alcoholic beverages. Think of the children. Brewers Retail Inc. and its owners maintain an active and well-established lobbying operation at the federal level as well. According to their website, Beer Canada represents brewing companies operating in Canada. Their members account for more than 90% of the domestic beer enjoyed by Canada's 10 million beer drinkers. So what does it matter that these big brewers control 80% of the beer market in Ontario? Well, other than basic fairness, the fact that the LCBO creates one of the lowest per capita dividends of any province in Canada might not solely be attributable to labor costs and marketing. If we compare the per capita net income of Ontario with that of Saskatchewan, where all stores are government-run and 80% of the beer isn't sold by a private beer store, we see an interesting number. The LCBO generates $1.7 billion in net income, or about $126 per person in the province, while the Saskatchewan Liquor Authority generates $209 per person on only $231 million in income. If Ontario had the same per capita net income as Saskatchewan, the LCBO's net income would be $2.8 billion, not $1.7 billion. So where did the extra $1 billion go? Is Saskatchewan's system just that much more efficient? Do their podcasts have lower production values? Their stores win fewer awards? Surely the LCBO's super cool, badass Whiskey Rocks campaign didn't cost that much. There's some revenue missing, and the beer store seems to account for most of it.
In my earlier research, I established that there are price differences in the same beer products between Ontario and Quebec. My calculations suggest that the incremental profits which brewers make in Ontario solely through the presence of the beer store ranges anything from $500 to $700 million. Then the assumption is that these are incremental profits which the government could have earned by directly regulating the beer store or maybe owning the beer store. And so these are foregone profits which the government is losing out on.
The next largest chunk of retail outlets are the private wine shops, often found in Ontario grocery stores or as standalone locations. These stores exist by virtue of licenses granted by the Ontario government decades ago and are held by 6 companies. These licenses are unique in the Ontario market, as other wineries are limited to selling wine in their on-premises winery outlets or in the LCBO. These private chains represent a significant government-created competitive advantage for these wineries. Another advantage is that these wineries get to keep more of the retail price of a bottle of wine sold through one of their private stores than they would selling through the LCBO.
They sell exclusively their own products. Most of the stuff they sell is actually not VQA wines, but wines blended with as little as 25% Canadian content.
It's hard to see how product listings and special treatment for a small number of private businesses has anything to do with social responsibility or underage drinking or alcohol abuse. On the one hand, this is all about politicians in the great province of Ontario, and alcohol keeps the labour peace with OPSU and the political donations flowing from Canada's national brewers, MOLSON and Labatt.
Whatever desire for change you have, as we know from political theory, it's expressed through elections, right? It becomes an issue, and then people decide whether or not they want change through their choice of candidates. But sometimes you don't have a clean translation of those choices. Sometimes if you have very strong interest groups which manage to capture the government or the regulatory process, change is not implemented, even though it might be efficient, even though it might be socially welfare enhancing.
Someone's going to stand up in the legislature someday with some leadership and some courage and say, here's what's happening. And if you do nothing, you're kind of complicit in it.
But politicians generally don't stand up and show leadership on any issue unless it might get them votes or lose them votes. The current system has many defenders who seem to ignore the high prices, lack of choice, and stagnation of Ontario businesses. Threats about the evils of a competitive market and lingering Protestant guilt seem to keep meaningful reform off the public agenda.
I think Canadian society is still deeply affected by the temperance movement, in the sense that the critique that was made of drinking went very deep. It went into law.
Even people who drink and who enjoy drinking don't consider that when it comes to their political activity or their citizenship or their voting or anything. I mean, there isn't even a discussion.
Not that long ago, someone stood up in the legislature and said, why can't we do this in convenience stores? The rest of the planet has managed to figure this out, and there's not looting and riots in Buffalo.
Much of the recent debate in the media around beverage alcohol retailing in Ontario has centered around whether to allow the sale of beer and wine in convenience stores. While it's just one option among many for the modernization of our retail system, it's an easy one to understand because it happens next door in Quebec, Michigan, and New York State.
Any road you take out of Ontario, any road, leads you to beer and wine in a private setting. There's no longer this monopolized control of the retail environment when it comes to alcohol sales.
Private retailing of liquor to consumers around the province is not a new concept. The LCBO themselves have licensed over 200 rural agency stores that might be in a little convenience store where they also do the Canada Post.
In April 2014, over 400,000 consumers voiced their support for beer and wine in convenience stores in the largest petition in Ontario's history, organized by the Ontario Convenience Stores Association. But clearly the Government of Ontario sees a big difference between selling alcohol in more than 200 agency stores across the province and the prospect of more than 10,000 convenience stores selling alcohol. Premier Kathleen Wynne has unequivocally rejected this scenario numerous times in the media. However, convenience store advocates maintain that it's just an extension of what's already happening and a win-win for the province and consumers.
So the model that we propose would allow the LCBO to expand their wholesaling activities across the province.
And the Brewers' retail opposition to the sale of beer in convenience stores is a bit puzzling, given that these same multinationals do it in almost every other jurisdiction on planet Earth.
So if you want to buy beer in Quebec, for the last 40 years, you buy it in our sector. And guess what? Those same 3 foreign multinational companies are our best friends. But in Ontario, we find that they're very offside with us, and they use every tool to be offside, and there has to be a hidden agenda why that has happened in Ontario.
But what about the beer store claim that convenience stores can't be trusted to sell beer and wine?
Every convenience store in Ontario is age-tested for tobacco, as an example, 4 times a year minimum with mystery shoppers. When it comes to lottery, we must ask for ID if you appear to be under 25. If we don't, we're fined. If we don't ask twice, we lose our terminal for 30 days. If we don't ask 3 times, we're out of the lottery business. So the incentive for us to be zero tolerant or close to zero tolerant is a huge incentive.
Could convenience stores be a viable sales channel for Ontario beer and wine producers?
The one thing that when I look at province of Ontario, Maxco operates 520 stores in the province of Ontario, and we operate 520 successful stores. 520 successful stores that we can make retrofits to include beer and wine in our stores, and we can make space for the craft brewers. Now, for the craft brewers or for Ontario wineries to try to duplicate that, it would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of capital dollars.
From a producer's perspective, I think corner stores are going to do what corner stores are currently doing. That is buying products from big producers with big brands.
But for the most part, you look in the US and all that, you're seeing more of the big guys in the corner stores. Why? Because they know that sells. They know people are going to run in and grab it. So you can do whatever you want, but unless you're opening up private sales or making a bigger market or putting something in the legislation that says you need to serve a certain amount of Ontario craft brews, it's not going to help until you open up the market to specialty shops.
In December 2012, as grumbling about the system continued, the LCBO announced the intention to pilot 10 LCBO Express kiosks at select grocery store locations. We haven't seen any of these stores yet.
To me, this is just more of the same. They are the same group of buyers with the same mix of products, working the same mix of hours with the same people staffing them.
More LCBO stores doesn't mean more brands. It's the same wines and beers that are currently listed in all the other stores would just be available in a new location.
This year, the AGCO announced the intention to allow Ontario wineries to sell their wine at farmers markets. Brewers, however, weren't invited to the party.
This seems like a very good idea to them. To our industry, it represents the smallest of opportunities imaginable and is certainly not going to move the needle at all in terms of allowing our industry to grow.
Selling VQA wine at a farmer's market 1 day a week for 6 months out of the year is not a new distribution system, but it's a start.
So the business opportunity for convenience stores is clear, but if our domestic producers don't see them as viable sales channels, what do they want?
So there's 2 things. We need access for consumers, we need convenience, convenient hours, and we need more shelves for a greater variety of product.
What could happen is allow us to have our own retail spaces, allow Ontario beer that is produced in Ontario by Ontario breweries to have their own retail markets that allowed the big guys shelf space as well.
I also think that there's a lot of craft beer fans out there that would love the opportunity to open a craft beer retail environment. Yeah, hands up, yeah.
Accessibility, regardless of whether it's to the big guys or the small guys. And also, as I said, I'd love to see the legislation change so that you can open up private shops. A private shop, you can import whatever you want.
All these stores would provide new options for consumers, new options for producers such as myself. Things like selection, convenience, pricing, all these things would be improved if there was a competing system in place.
What they did in BC about 10 years ago is they allowed private wine and beer stores to evolve, the LRS stores. They now have 700 of them in the province.
The BC experiment has worked quite well in generating more government revenue.
A lot of provinces in Canada have these already. Most of the United States has this already. In fact, most of the world has this already.
And all the craft beers are offered there. There's one store, Legacy Store. They've got over 1,000 beers in their cooler. They have hundreds and hundreds of local wines from the Okanagan that aren't available in liquor stores.
They have it in their heads that any competing channel will just take away from their revenue stream. And we're quite certain that's incorrect.
While it generates significant revenue for the government, it also does it at significant cost. It's not efficient, and competition would force the LCBO to be more efficient, which I think is sorely needed.
You may have noticed that the price of a bottle of Ontario beer, wine, or whiskey is the same whether you buy it from the LCBO, an agency store, or from the facility where it was produced. What changes is who gets to keep the markup. For advocates of a competing private system, this is where the opportunity lies. When a bottle of wine is purchased at an Ontario winery, that winery keeps the bulk of the markup. But when the same bottle is purchased at an LCBO agency store, the store and the LCBO split the markup. Private liquor stores could simply operate as agency stores do, splitting the markup with the LCBO. Advocates say this scenario would actually result in more revenue for the LCBO because the board would preserve its existing market dominance through its network of retail stores, but also make money from every bottle sold in a private store. More stores, more sales, more government revenue. But to some, that's a problem.
Of course, the idea of having an alternate channel in the province always brings up the boogeyman of social responsibility.
There are those in Ontario whose health and well-being are damaged or destroyed by alcohol abuse. Alcohol abuse is why we had prohibition, and it's why we have the LCBO. Dr. Norman Giesbrecht is one of the world's foremost researchers in the areas of social and epidemiological research related to alcohol policy. His June 2013 report, Reducing Alcohol-Related Harms and Costs in Ontario, points to a list of common public policy levers used to control harm caused by alcohol.
If you have a price that's, let's say, adjusted to the cost of living, have a minimum price that is tailored to the strength of the alcohol, that's been shown to impact purchasing habits.
And this is why the retail cost of a bottle of whiskey is $26 when the wholesale cost is around $6. Whiskey is more dangerous than beer or wine, the thinking goes, so the minimum cost for whiskey should be comparatively higher by volume, and the Ontario government cashes in.
When you change the control system, what typically happens is you have an increase in the number of outlets, so you have an increase in the physical availability. You typically have an increase in hours and days of sale. You typically have more challenges with regard to the selling of alcohol. So you're likely not going to have the same level of checks and balances in terms of selling alcohol to minors or selling alcohol to intoxicated people.
This is the most common argument against the private sale of beverage alcohol that you hear from the LCBO and, strangely, the beer store. They both claim that the private sector cannot be trusted to sell alcohol, of course forgetting that the beer store is a private company and forgetting that there are more private liquor retailers in Ontario than public retailers.
Unfortunately, there has not been a definitive study, as far as I know, in Ontario or any place in Canada where you have an independent group go in and test in an unannounced way, what are the probabilities of being served. They're using the beer store and using the wine store or the LCBO as a point of focus. The third one is what's called physical availability. That refers to the number of outlets, both the hours and days and combined, and the density have been shown to be related to consumption levels and harm from alcohol.
Over the last few decades, the steady trend of both LCBO and beer stores is longer hours, more retail locations, and larger, more stylish stores. The LCBO has repeatedly announced their pilot project to put express kiosks in grocery stores. Buy more, just buy it from the government.
I'm not sure that the LCBO and the people at the government departments that support it have been convinced by that, because they certainly have made alcohol more accessible as the years have gone by.
There's also lots of marketing gone on by government sources, such as the LCBO. But I think that the volume of marketing, the number of inserts, seems to be somewhat contradictory, at least from my perspective, to having a responsible distribution of alcohol.
The level of advertising to promote the sale of alcoholic beverages by the LCBO does seem at odds with the addiction research literature, especially for a government monopoly. There's also nowhere else to go for spirits or imported wine, but that doesn't stop them from running ads in a range of media and spending over $1 million a year on an Air Miles program to reward customers for not going someplace else to buy liquor. There's the magazine, the high production value video and audio podcasts. Let's not forget the embarrassing Whiskey Rocks campaign.
The LCBO's own policies now, in the way they market alcohol, suggest something quite different. For 25 years, they've been making it look like the coolest thing you could possibly do. They turned their stores into these lavish emporiums of fascinating liquids to consume, with giveaways and free magazines to tell you what to drink and how often to drink and what to cook with and so on. The original founders of the LCBO must be spinning in their graves.
So where does this leave the province's craft beer, wine, and spirits producers who want better access to the retail market in Ontario? Is it really a choice between supporting Ontario producers and increased disease, injury, and death?
I think, in general these days, people are much better educated. That's kind of why I think the craft brewing industry is in a particularly comfortable niche, is that their products are perceived as being, more special, more unique, something that you don't grab a case or two of and take out. You might grab 2 or 3 650ml bottles and share them with some friends.
And it's not something you do by yourself in the basement out of a can. It's just a different mentality about what it represents.
When we decided to do this, we kind of wanted to take a very different approach to distilling in general, and we put that on our label, exactly what we're doing.
We're not just schlepping beers, where you put out the cheapest product you possibly can, the most of it, sell it at the cheapest, and move as much as you possibly can.
Part of our model is not to mass produce, but to craft each beer.
What makes our product craft, the scale of production.
We can do small runs of interesting grains. We'll sell it at the distillery, and people can come in and pick something up that they'll never get on an LCBO shelf or anywhere else.
The idea that as a brand, we get to interact with our fans and customers on the label itself, face to face, whether or not that's in the retail environment or in our brewery itself, it's far more valuable to us. We don't have billion-dollar marketing budgets.
We don't market falsely with dancing girls and people running in fields and things. We say, here's the beer, like it, don't like it.
What we can offer is a higher quality product and fantastic relationships.
We want to make sure that our product is 100% every time, and if we're not happy with it, we're not putting it out. So in order to get bigger, we want to make sure our quality is maintained and people know us better first.
Slow down, enjoy yourself. We worked hard to make it. It's worth it. It's worth savoring. So go ahead and do that. Then that changes the whole thing going all the way backwards.
People are learning that drinking beer is a different kind of experience than what we've been trained in Ontario.
I grew up with Good Things Grow in Ontario, and that worked. I've bought in my whole life. So
breweries used to have ties to communities.
You were from London, you drank Labatt.
I think breweries and small breweries are big parts of neighborhoods. It's been a fantastic fit for us.
Well, 30% of our business is growlers. So that's catered directly to locals who keep coming back to fill up their growlers.
You're servicing your local community, the whole shop local, the whole buy local thing. That's all working to your favor.
I wanted to bring something into Niagara that helped expose all of what Ontario has to offer, all of what Niagara has to offer, be it from Ridgeway, be it from Niagara Falls, be it from St. Catharines. It didn't matter. As long as it was local, it was something I wanted to do.
Just having your main base of customers is the people living right in your very town is what means the world to us.
People want to buy local. People are excited about trying new things.
It's good for the local economy. It's good for jobs. It's good for agriculture. It's good for tourism. And we would love to see the government better support the industry.
you're looking at about anywhere from $10, $15, $20 additional economic activity per bottle of wine if it's actually produced in the province and sold in the province versus an imported product.
Despite the challenges of operating in Ontario, intrepid entrepreneurs continue to open new businesses and work within the current system. The wine industry has seen excellent growth since the mid-70s, when only a handful of wineries were in operation. Today, there are more than 180. The Ontario craft beer industry is in a golden age, with approximately 105 breweries making a palate-blowing array of products, and dozens more expected by the end of the year. We even have a few craft distillers plying their trade in a market segment dominated by global brands.
Today, I think we're miles ahead of where we were 5 years ago.
Change is coming here. People are talking about it. People are talking about change with social responsibility.
On the social responsibility side, it's pretty clear to me that the government uses that as a smokescreen. And they're very quick to whip up hysteria and use that as cover.
Well, that has nothing to do with health. It has everything to do with perceptions of order and control.
No one's arguing in favor of less safety or even less regulation. Regulate me all you want. Just tell me what they are and I'll follow along. Just give me some access to the market. Take the big guys out of the way and you'll see it change immediately. Make it fair.
VQA wines have about a 20% market share at best in Ontario. We're a long way off from owning our own marketplace. And that has everything to do with our lack of access.
The biggest thing for the customers is access to beer. And I think the biggest thing that small brewers need to find is fairness in the marketplace.
The regulators themselves know this. They must be, someone at the AGCO today is tired of going into work and enforcing a ridiculous law. They know it's ridiculous.
Honestly, complaining and being frustrated is not going to fix anything. We have to fix it ourselves if we want any changes to happen.
I think if you look at this piece 5 years from now, hopefully none of this makes sense. Hopefully it's changed so much that none of these concerns are real anymore.
But I'm the kind of man for quality is number one. That's why I reach first for innocent gun. And for the girls, it's Alizé and Bacardi. That's how you know that we're having a party. Mix and match if you got enough scratch. And when you run out, you raid your buddy's roommate stash. And so you think there's no more drink in the nation, that's when you remember you're near an extended hours location.
I deserve, cause I need a man to make me a her. Prince Igor, he's royalty, but still a Jerry, that's the man for me. Walk the plank with Captain Morgan, with Johnny Walker strolling, but when I'm drinking wine, it's always ladies' night out.
Cabinet, I see supplies are getting low. I don't panic though, just go to LCBO. They know my name there, service with a smile, and the cashier know that I always got my air mile. I live my life in a state of denial, but when I'm drinking alone, at least I'm drinking in style. We sipping Palm Bays all day, every day. They got a great way to keep this buzz maintained. And when I'm at the cottage, only got one motto: Caesar's in the AM, pass the vodka with the Mott's Clamato. So many wines from around the globe, they got me feeling like I'm Carmen Sandiego.
Guaranteed to provide you with the best selections in the local in between, united in the LCBO, we're all the same. Thank you for shopping at the Liquor Control Board of Ontario.